The world stood quietly, poised at the threshold of transformation. It was the fading light of the Proterozoic, when billions of years had already passed in silence, when oceans rolled endlessly against barren shores, and when the air, though different now than it had been, still carried an edge of danger. The earth wore no forests, no carpets of grass, no calls of creatures echoing across the plains. Its surface was stone and water, its music the rhythm of waves and the whisper of winds. Yet within its oceans, life persisted, humble, ancient, and unyielding. Imagine the scene: broad expanses of microbial mats, slimy living quilts spreading across the shallow seabed, glowing faintly with photosynthetic activity as they captured sunlight. They built their world grain by grain, layer by layer, leaving behind stromatolites like towers of patience, each one a monument to time itself. These colonies were not aware of their legacy, not aware that their unbroken labor had already shifted the atmosphere of Earth forever. For in their endless hunger, in their constant exchange of sunlight for oxygen, they had changed the very composition of the air. But for all their achievements, the world above them remained cruel. The sun did not only give warmth and light, it gave invisible fire, the sharp, unforgiving touch of ultraviolet rays. For fragile molecules of life, for delicate strands of DNA, this invisible force was devastating. It broke bonds, twisted patterns, scarred and burned. To live upon the surface of land, or even in the uppermost waters where sunlight streamed without hindrance, was to risk annihilation. And so life had retreated. It huddled in shaded pools, sank into deeper waters, wrapped itself in protective mucus layers, and learned patience. The Earth was alive, but in hiding. Still above the blue oceans and silent coasts, a change was beginning. Far beyond the reach of the tallest waves, high in the rarefied layers of air where only the thinnest clouds could wander, oxygen itself was learning a new trick. Molecules of O2, set free by the work of cyanobacteria, drifted upward into the stratosphere, where they met the fierce hand of ultraviolet sunlight. Instead of destruction, something remarkable occurred. Atoms split apart, then rejoined into threes, becoming ozone, O3. Each fragile molecule was a shield, absorbing the very rays that had once torn life apart. At first, there were only scattered patches of this shield, thin wisps that came and went like smoke in the wind. But over endless ages, they multiplied, spread, and began to form the faintest veil across the sky. This was no sudden miracle. It was the slow, invisible weaving of protection, a fabric stitched molecule by molecule. The process was delicate, like the beginning of a blanket being knitted by unseen hands, each new thread joining another until at last it could cover and comfort. Though fragile at first, the ozone's presence meant something profound. The Earth was beginning to learn how to guard its children. Imagine standing there, if you could, at the edge of one of those ancient shallow seas. The air would not yet feel like ours, still raw and unfamiliar, still thin and harsh, yet the sky would shimmer with potential. To the eye, it would be the same sunlit dome, bright and unrelenting, but something had shifted in its depths. Rays of sunlight that once fell mercilessly now bent, softened, absorbed into the growing veil. Slowly, imperceptibly, the light was changing. The blue of the heavens began to deepen, a gentler hue taking shape, as though the sky itself were learning kindness. Beneath this sky, life continued in ignorance. The mats spread wider, stromatolites grew taller, early multicellular organisms stirred in the shallows, experimenting with cooperation and form. None knew that they were safer than their ancestors had been, that their generations would suffer fewer wounds from the sky. They simply lived as life always had, quietly, persistently, resilient in the face of uncertainty. Yet something new was unfolding above them. Something that would one day allow forests to breathe, animals to roam, and humanity itself to look upward and see not only the stars, but the beauty of a blue world. This was the moment before the grand flourishing, the pause before the song began in full. Earth, scarred by impacts, frozen in ancient ice, reshaped by storms and tides, was now clothing itself in a protective garment. It was a gift forged by accident, born from chemistry and time, but it would prove to be one of the most important changes in the history of the planet. The ozone shield was forming, an invisible guardian, an unseen quilt of safety. The prelude closes not in conclusion, but in anticipation. The Earth was no longer a fragile ember exposed to the raw fires of space. It was wrapping itself, slowly and carefully in a new protection. The sky was becoming gentle, and with that gentleness came promise, the promise that life, once bound to shadows and depths, would soon step into the light and thrive. Long before the sky softened, before any veil of protection had spread across the heavens, the architects of change were already at work. They were not mighty beasts or towering plants. They were small, almost invisible, yet their influence touched every corner of the earth. They were cyanobacteria, the ancient weavers of breath, the quiet makers of oxygen. Picture the shallow seas of the Proterozoic, warmed by the steady sun and stirred by tides that rolled endlessly against rocky shores. These seas were not barren, though no fish swam in their depths, no forests crowned their edges. Instead, they shimmered with living carpets, mats of microbes layered one atop another, clinging to rocks, spreading across mudflats, turning sunlight into sustenance. At first glance, they would seem unremarkable, a slippery film, a soft green haze drifting beneath the surface. But within these colonies, an extraordinary process unfolded, one that reshaped the destiny of the planet. Cyanobacteria had discovered photosynthesis, this quiet magic of turning light into food, water into life's spark, and in the process, releasing oxygen as waste. Each breath of oxygen exhaled into the water, each molecule drifting upward toward the sky, was a note in a slow, patient song that lasted for billions of years. They worked tirelessly, unaware of their impact, unknowing that they were painting the atmosphere itself with a new color. For the early Earth, oxygen was not a gift at first. It was a poison to many of the simpler forms of life that had thrived in its absence. Anaerobic creatures, accustomed to a world without it, recoiled and perished as oxygen levels slowly rose. There were die-offs, silent extinctions, and collapses of ancient communities. Yet out of this upheaval, a new world emerged, one where oxygen became the foundation for resilience, energy, and complexity. Cyanobacteria did not stop. Their mats grew thicker, their reach expanded across shallow waters, and their legacy was written into the rocks themselves. Layer by layer, they built stromatolites, towering structures of stone and life. Imagine them as ancient monuments rising in slow motion, each ring a story of sunlight captured, each ridge a memory of life's persistence. They grew in quiet harbors, on tidal flats, in sunlit lagoons, patient and unyielding. The oxygen they gave off did not stay long in the water. It bubbled upward, collecting in the air. At first, the air swallowed it greedily, binding it with iron, sinking it into stone. For a time, the oxygen could not linger. It painted the oceans red with rust, banding the rocks with iron oxides, laying down layers that geologists today find shimmering with crimson and ochre. These banded iron formations, scattered across the globe, are the geological diaries of those first breaths. They tell us that oxygen was being exhaled in abundance, even if it did not yet remain in the sky. But the Earth has patience. Over millions upon millions of years, the great iron sinks filled. The ocean's hunger was satisfied, and slowly oxygen began to linger, not just in the seas but in the air. The atmosphere was shifting, molecule by molecule, until one day the world that had once been suffocating and unbreathable began to hold a trace of this new gas. That trace grew, strengthened, and altered the very chemistry of the skies. It was not a swift change. No creature alive then could have marked a single moment when the world tilted from one state to another. It was a story of generations upon generations, of countless lives rising and falling, each leaving behind the smallest contribution to a greater whole. It was a story written in persistence. Cyanobacteria did not know that their gift was dangerous, nor that it would someday become salvation. They simply lived, as microbes do, multiplying in sunlight, dividing, and filling every crevice the seas allowed. The atmosphere thickened with their breath. To imagine it is to imagine a world in flux, the sky shifting, the oceans sparkling with change, the air carrying a scent unknown before. With oxygen, flames could burn hotter. With oxygen, chemistry itself would begin to dance differently. And high above, where the air thinned and the sun's harsh rays struck hardest, oxygen was gathering, waiting to be reshaped into something more powerful still. But this first stage was about abundance, about the steady, unwavering release of oxygen into the world. Without it, there could be no ozone, no shield, no protection. It was the foundation laid by the smallest of beings, the endless size of microscopic lives that would one day allow forests to sway in breezes, creatures to breathe deeply, and civilizations to kindle fire. The breath of the ancients was not a single gust, but a ceaseless exhalation, a chorus of tiny voices singing across billions of years. And as the song grew louder, the earth itself began to change its tune. What was once a world of shadowed survival was becoming a world with the possibility of light, and what was once a barren sky was preparing to cradle life in safety. High above the seas and coasts of the Proterozoic Earth, where the air thinned and the silence of space pressed close, a quiet transformation was stirring. The oxygen that had poured forth for millions of years, the breath of countless microbial mats and stromatolites, was no longer confined to the oceans or captured by the hungry embrace of iron in the rocks. It drifted higher now, carried upward in unseen currents, until it reached the fragile boundary where the Earth's atmosphere met the ceaseless brilliance of the sun. There in the lofty reaches of the stratosphere, sunlight struck with unrelenting force. Ultraviolet rays, sharp and merciless, cut through the thin air, breaking apart the bonds of oxygen molecules. Where once there had been two atoms bound in partnership, suddenly they were torn asunder, single atoms drifting like sparks in a great dark sky. These atoms, set free by destruction, did not wander alone for long. They reached for neighbors, found one another, and joined with fresh O2 molecules. In that moment of reunion, a new form was born, ozone, O3. It was a fragile molecule, delicate and fleeting, yet it carried a power out of proportion to its size. Ozone could do what ordinary oxygen could not. It could drink in ultraviolet light, absorb its fury, and soften its strike. In the beginning, there were only hints of it, whispers of protection, scattered pockets here and there. The air was not yet changed enough for a true layer to form, and yet the seeds were planted. The process had begun. Imagine it as a loom strung across the sky, with sunlight both tearing and weaving at once. Each violent strike of ultraviolet light split oxygen apart, but in the same instant, new bonds formed, more complex and more protective. It was as if the very act of destruction carried within it the recipe for salvation. Each ozone molecule born was a thread added to the loom, a fragment of cloth stretched thin across the dome of the planet. Too thin at first, too sparse to make much difference, but persistent. Like the steady weaving of a blanket, stitch after stitch, molecule after molecule, it would grow. The Earth did not know it was changing. Its oceans rolled as they always had, tides pulled by the same moon, winds stirred across barren land. Life clung to stone, bubbled in shallows and spread across mats, unaware of the new presence forming above. Yet something was shifting in the feel of the sunlight. The harshest rays still came through, burning and destructive, but here and there, in faint measure, they were softened. The light that reached the shallows began to change in tone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was a change nonetheless, and life beneath that light would come to notice the difference across countless generations. The seeds of the shield grew with every breath released below, with every cyanobacterial sigh, with every photon of light striking oxygen in the stratosphere. Slowly, the balance shifted. The air grew richer in oxygen, and with it, the capacity for ozone increased. What began as scattered pockets became threads, what threads became patches, what patches began to drift toward a fabric. Picture it now, an invisible veil being stretched across the world, not yet whole, not yet strong, but present. Sunlight still cut through mercilessly, but it was no longer unchecked. The rays were fractured, bent, absorbed in part, weakened as they passed through. The sky, though still bright and sharp, had begun to learn gentleness. There is something almost tender in this chemistry, this idea that the same sunlight which once threatened all life could, by interacting with the breath of microbes, create the very protection that life needed to flourish. It was a cycle of transformation, destruction giving rise to creation, danger giving way to shelter. The seeds of the shield were not just molecules of ozone. They were promises written in the air, foreshadowing the safety and stability that would one day cradle forests and animals and children beneath a softened sky. These early ozone wisps would not have seemed like much. The air was still raw, the radiation still biting, the world still fragile. But from such beginnings, great change always flows. A blanket begins with a single stitch, a forest begins with a single seed, and a shield capable of protecting an entire planet begins with the simplest act of light striking oxygen in the high atmosphere. The seeds had been planted, and though the earth below could not yet feel their full effect, the sky was changing. A guardian was being born in silence, unseen yet essential, high above the waters where life still waited. High above the seas and barren coasts, the sky shimmered with something new. The oxygen released by the tireless labor of cyanobacteria had been climbing higher and higher, drifting into the thin reaches of the stratosphere where sunlight reigned with an unchallenged brilliance. Their ultraviolet light, fierce, invisible, and merciless, tore apart oxygen molecules with each strike. And yet, in that very act of breaking, something stronger was made. Two atoms that had once been bound were split apart, freed into silence, and then, almost instinctively, one found another pair and joined them, weaving a third atom into the bond. Ozone was born, O3, fragile and rare, but with a remarkable gift. It could catch the ultraviolet strike, absorb its power, and blunt its edge. At first, this miracle was scattered, faint, so thin as to be almost non-existent. A patch here, a patch there, like wisps of smoke drifting across a windowpane. The sky had not yet changed, and to the life below, nothing seemed different. The harsh rays of the sun still poured down onto the shallow seas, still split delicate strands of DNA, still burned the fragile bodies of cells that drifted too close to the surface. But even so, a new balance had been set into motion. For every molecule destroyed, another was reborn. For every ultraviolet strike absorbed, one less ray fell on the waters below. Imagine these first wisps of ozone as a gossamer fabric stretched across the heavens, full of holes, too fragile to be trusted, and yet undeniably present. Through it, sunlight still streamed, but softened slightly in tone, weakened ever so gently in its bite. Like the thinnest of curtains across a blazing window, it did not block the brilliance, but began to tame its fury. For the microbes below, the difference was not something they could notice in a single day or even in a single 1,000 years. But across generations, across millions of tiny divisions and mutations, the difference began to matter. Life that had once been forced to stay in deeper waters, clinging to shadows, began to drift a little closer to the surface. Some colonies of stromatolites grew a little taller, catching a little more light. The danger was still immense, but the margin of safety was slightly greater than before. There is a softness in this story, a patience that matches the rhythm of time itself. No sudden miracle split the world between danger and safety. Instead, the first wisps of protection arrived like whispers, like threads of comfort weaving themselves into the sky molecule by molecule. They were invisible, unnoticed, yet profoundly important. They promised that the cruelty of sunlight could one day be softened into something more nurturing. Picture the Earth in those days from far above, as if you were a watcher drifting in the dark of space. The planet turned slowly, its oceans gleaming blue-green beneath a sky that shimmered faintly with ozone. To the eye, there would be no difference. You would see the same pale clouds, the same sunlit waters, but in the invisible wavelengths, in the realm of ultraviolet light, the story was different. There, for the first time, rays that had once passed unimpeded were intercepted, absorbed, held. The Earth had begun to shield itself. And though the shield was fragile, it grew. Every day, as long as sunlight struck oxygen high above, ozone was created anew. It was a cycle of making and unmaking, of destruction and protection intertwined. Ultraviolet light split oxygen apart, but in doing so, it allowed ozone to form, and ozone in turn caught that same ultraviolet light. It was a paradox of balance. The danger became the guardian, the destroyer became the protector. On the surface, the microbial mats carried on their endless work, breathing oxygen into the air, feeding the stratosphere with more and more of the raw material needed to make ozone. The smallest lives, with no awareness of what they were building, were shaping a sky that would one day allow forests to grow, creatures to roam, and children to play in sunlight without fear. The wisps of protection were their legacy, a gift that stretched far beyond their own existence. There is comfort in this thought, that safety often begins in whispers, that shields are not always forged in sudden strength, but in fragile beginnings. The first wisps of ozone were not yet the blanket Earth needed, but they were the promise of it. They were the first threads in the great quilt that would one day wrap the planet in protection, making it not just habitable, but welcoming. And so the story of life entered a new phase. The sky was no longer a window of pure fire, it was a window with the faintest of curtains, a veil of safety just beginning to take shape. The first wisps of protection drifted across the heavens, and beneath them, life unknowingly began to dream of a future it had never before dared to imagine. High above the rolling oceans and barren continents of the Proterozoic, the air thinned into a realm few could imagine, a realm of silence and light, of chemistry and transformation. This was the stratosphere, the quiet ceiling of the world, and it was here that Earth's greatest tapestry was being woven. For in this lofty place, where the invisible hand of ultraviolet sunlight struck with relentless energy, oxygen was being broken apart and remade into something stronger, something protective. It is easy to think of air as empty, as nothing more than the space we move through. But here, in the heights of the atmosphere, air was a field alive with activity. Molecules of oxygen drifted upward, buoyed by currents of warmth, where they met the fierce brilliance of the sun. Each strike of ultraviolet light was both an act of destruction and creation. O2 split into single atoms, atoms rejoined into O3, ozone. And with each fragile molecule formed, the sky gained another thread in its unseen fabric of protection. To imagine it, picture a loom stretched wide across the heavens, strung with threads of oxygen, each one waiting for sunlight to weave it into place. The shuttle of ultraviolet light moved back and forth ceaselessly, sometimes unraveling the threads, sometimes stitching them into stronger patterns. It was a loom not guided by hands, but by the rhythm of physics and chemistry, a loom that had been set into motion by the endless breath of microbes below. The tapestry at first was full of holes, a thin scattering of threads too delicate to be trusted. But as time passed, the threads grew thicker, the patterns more complete. The sun, once a merciless destroyer, became also the weaver, shaping its own fury into a shield. The sky itself was learning to guard the world. Beneath this great loom, the earth turned slowly. Days passed into nights, nights into days, and with each cycle, the stratosphere continued its silent weaving. To the life below, these changes were imperceptible. Microbial mats still clung to shallow rocks, stromatolites still layered themselves in patient silence, and the first multicellular experiments still stirred faintly in the hidden corners of the sea. None knew that their sunlight was being softened, that their world was becoming slightly less perilous with each passing age. The stratospheric loom was tireless. Where threads were broken, new ones were spun. Where holes opened, new patterns emerged. It was a dance of fragility and resilience, of making and unmaking, repeated endlessly, patiently, until the veil of ozone began to take shape. Imagine the comfort of this weaving, if one could feel it, the sense of a blanket being drawn slowly over the planet, stitch by stitch, until the harsh light above was filtered through something gentler. The ozone layer was not yet whole, not yet strong enough to shield life fully, but its promise was already written in the skies. The Earth was being clothed. From space, had there been eyes to see, the change would have been invisible. The planet's colors would remain the same: blue seas, white clouds, barren land. But in the unseen wavelengths of ultraviolet, the transformation was profound. Rays that had once blazed through unopposed now dimmed, caught and absorbed by a growing shield. The stratospheric loom was weaving not only a fabric of molecules, but a future where life could step boldly out of the shadows. And in this slow weaving, there was patience and inevitability. The loom would not stop. So long as oxygen filled the air and sunlight touched the sky, the threads would continue to be drawn. The ozone shield was not an accident of a moment, but the destiny of persistence, the natural result of breath meeting light. It was a tapestry begun in whispers, but destined to become a quilt that would cradle every living thing to come. The stratosphere, once a realm of harshness and destruction, had become Earth's workshop of safety. It was here, in this quiet, unseen loom, that the fate of life was being rewritten, not in sudden strokes, but in patient weaving. And with each new thread of ozone, the sky leaned a little closer toward kindness. The sun had always been both a giver and a destroyer. From the very birth of the planet, it poured its endless light upon the earth, warming seas, stirring winds, driving the quiet engines of photosynthesis. Yet bound up in that same light was something harsher, sharper, invisible to the eye but devastating to the fragile chemistry of life. Ultraviolet radiation was the fire within sunlight's gift, a flame that burned not with warmth but with ruin. For billions of years, it had struck Earth's surface unchecked, splitting molecules, unraveling the delicate strands of DNA, forcing life to hide in shadows and waters too deep for its touch. But now high above the world, something has shifted. Ozone, born of oxygen and sunlight, had begun to gather in the stratosphere. Not in a sudden flood, not in a miracle wrought in a single day, but slowly, quietly, like threads being spun in the background of time. These molecules, fragile and fleeting on their own, together began to form a veil, a soft but powerful curtain across the sky. It was not yet whole. It was full of holes, constantly torn and rewoven, fragile in its balance. And yet, even in this fragile state, it began to make a difference. Where ultraviolet rays had once fallen freely, they now encountered resistance. Some slipped through, but others were absorbed, caught, and held by ozone's embrace. Each photon of light that was captured became heat instead of harm, energy transformed from destruction into something gentler. The sky was learning how to shield. Picture it as curtains being drawn across a window in a bright room. Without them, the light is too harsh, blinding and overwhelming, stripping the comfort from the space. But with the curtains pulled across, the light softens. It still fills the room, still warms it, but in a way that can be lived in, a way that comforts rather than sears. That is what ozone was becoming for Earth, a curtain against the fire, a gentle filter that allowed sunlight to nurture life without destroying it. The change was slow, imperceptible to the creatures of the seas. Microbes went on multiplying, stromatolites built their patient towers, multicellular colonies experimented in the safety of shallow waters. None of them could name the shield forming above, none of them could recognize the danger lessening around them. But over generations, the difference was written into their survival. Mutations that might once have been shredded by ultraviolet rays are now endured. Generations that might have been cut short now continued. The curtain was thin, but it gave life a chance to linger in places it had never dared before. From the perspective of the planet itself, the transformation was profound. The atmosphere, once a mere mix of gases stirred by winds, had become an active guardian. The stratosphere was no longer just air, it was a barrier, a quilt, a boundary between Earth's surface and the harshness of the cosmos. The ultraviolet fire that once penetrated to the shallows of the ocean was now scattered, filtered, softened. The Earth was stepping out from under the glare of a merciless sun and into a light that was gentler, more livable. There is something deeply comforting in this story, the way destruction and creation intertwined, the way sunlight, once cruel, became part of the process that built its own softening. The same ultraviolet rays that had burned life were the very ones that split oxygen, the very ones that allowed ozone to be born. It was as though the fire itself had been taught to dim its blaze, as though the world had discovered how to tame the flame without extinguishing its warmth. Imagine looking upward on one of those ancient days. The sky would seem no different to the eye, vast, blue, infinite, yet hidden within it was an invisible curtain, drawn molecule by molecule, turning the blaze into a glow. Imagine the comfort this brought to the tiny lives below, though they could not name it. For the first time, the surface of the seas was becoming a place of possibility, a place where light was not only a threat, but also a gift. The curtains were thin still, delicate, easily torn, but each day they grew stronger. Each day more oxygen drifted upward, each day more ozone formed, each day the balance tipped towards safety. And though the creatures of that time could not know it, the Earth itself was being prepared for a future where sunlight would no longer mean retreat, but expansion. The fire had not been extinguished. The sun still blazed as fiercely as ever, still pouring its endless energy upon the planet, but the ozone curtain had begun to change the relationship between Earth and its star. No longer was life only scorched by its rays, now it was sheltered, cradled, nurtured. The harsh fire had been veiled, transformed into a glow that whispered of possibility. And beneath that glow, life endured. Beneath that glow, life began to dream, though it did not yet know what it was dreaming of. For as long as Earth had turned beneath the sun, its skies had glowed with a pale brightness, blue yes, but sharp, almost raw, its light untempered by protection. It was a sky that carried beauty and danger in equal measure, a sky that gleamed but also seared. Ultraviolet rays poured through it, invisible to the eye but devastating to life. For microbes beneath the water, this brilliance was both a promise and a threat. It offered energy to fuel photosynthesis, but it carried with it a sharp edge that scarred, burned, and unmade. But with the gathering of ozone above, the sky began to change. It was not a sudden transformation, not a shift one could witness in a single sunrise. It was instead a gradual softening, stretched across millions of years. Day after day, the ozone curtain thickened, its threads woven tighter by the endless interplay of oxygen and sunlight. And with each layer added, with each fragile molecule joined to the growing fabric, the very quality of the light that touched Earth began to shift. Imagine standing on a barren shoreline then, if one could. The horizon would still blaze with morning light, the seas would still glitter under the sun, but something would feel different. The sharpness of the glow would have dimmed, just slightly, as though the air itself had learned how to breathe more gently. The sky's color deepened, becoming richer, its blue more profound. It was not merely the scattering of light in air, it was the scattering of light filtered through protection. The world was gaining a new kind of beauty. The skies above, once harsh, began to cradle the planet in a hue that hinted of stability. The endless dome of blue we take for granted today was being written into being. What had once been pale and unsteady became deep, calm, and enduring. The sky itself was learning how to comfort. For life below, the difference was not only in what could be seen, but in what could be felt. Shallow waters, once perilous, grew less hostile. Microbial mats at the edges of coasts could bask longer in sunlight without retreating. The first multicellular colonies, fragile and tentative, could drift nearer to the surface, catching rays that nourished without burning. The ultraviolet fire still came, but now it was softened, muted, transformed into a glow that nurtured. It was as though the earth had pulled a veil across its face, turning its expression from stern to gentle. The color of the sky mirrored this change. Its deepening blue was not just an aesthetic, it was a signal, a quiet announcement that the air had learned to guard what lived beneath it. The brilliance of the sun was still there, but it was now seen through the lens of safety, tinted with kindness. From space, had one looked back upon the Earth in those days, the change would have been striking. The planet's oceans gleamed with the same blue-green shimmer, but the sky surrounding them glowed deeper, softer, more saturated. A planet that once seemed raw and unguarded now shimmered with a hint of familiarity, beginning to look like the homeworld we know. And beneath that sky, life pressed forward. It was not a conscious recognition, not a sudden migration toward the light, but a slow shift written into the rhythms of survival. More organisms lingered near the surface, more colonies stretched upward, more generations endured. The color of the sky was a reflection of chemistry, but it was also a reflection of possibility. There is a quiet poetry in this transformation, that the very breath of ancient microbes, rising into the heavens, could repaint the canvas of the world, that the smallest of beings, working tirelessly in silence, could deepen the blue of the sky and soften the fire of the sun, that the beauty we see when we look upward today is a gift from lives that never knew it themselves. The sky was no longer just a dome of air above a fragile world. It had become a shield, a guardian, and now, a canvas of color that reflected its new role. Where once the heavens had glared, now they glowed. And beneath that glow, life found a little more room to grow, a little more time to endure, a little more comfort in the light of day. The sky had changed color, and with it, the earth had changed its mood. The planet was no longer only a place of survival, it was becoming a place of shelter. And in that shelter, the seeds of the future waited, ready for the moment when the world would burst into complexity. Beneath the softened sky, the oceans stirred with a new kind of shimmer. For countless ages, their surface had been a place of danger, bathed in light too fierce to endure. Ultraviolet rays pierced the upper layers, breaking apart fragile molecules, punishing any living thing that drifted too close. Life had learned caution. It had stayed low, clung to shaded crevices, and built its strength in the safety of depths. The surface was bright but merciless, an open stage no actor could long survive upon. But as the ozone veil above began to weave itself thicker, the oceans felt the change. The sun still shone, golden and brilliant, but its sharpest edge was blunted, its invisible fire tamed. Rays that once split DNA with merciless precision now dimmed, absorbed before they could strike. The surface, once an arena of risk, began to soften into a place of possibility. Imagine the shallows then, warm tidal pools, glittering lagoons, stretches of coast where water rose and fell in endless rhythm. Once these places had been perilous for life, exposed to the full blaze of the sun. But now, under gentler sky, they began to welcome more of the microbial mats that spread like living carpets. Stromatolites rose from the seafloor, layer upon patient layer, reaching higher than before, their tops basking in light they could finally trust. The shallows, once scars of emptiness, began to glow with life. Photosynthesis flourished under this new balance. Sunlight still reached the surface in abundance, but now, freed from its cruelest component, it became a steady gift. Algae-like organisms, drifting colonies, and mats spread farther, glowing faintly green and gold as they transformed light into energy. Oxygen production increased in response, and with it, the ozone shield above thickened still further. It was a cycle of resilience. The more life grew in the softened light, the stronger the shield became, and the stronger the shield became, the more life could grow. There is something profoundly cozy in this reciprocity, the ocean and the sky working hand in hand, each feeding the other, each protecting the other, each preparing the way for the next step. The microbes did not know it. The ozone molecules did not choose it. Yet together, through nothing more than the steady rhythm of chemistry and survival, they crafted a balance that transformed a world. To imagine the sight is to see waters dappled with light, their surfaces no longer terrifying but welcoming. The sunbeams, though still strong, now reached the shallow seafloor in a way that nurtured instead of burned. Colonies of life could stretch upward, spread outward, and linger where once they had withdrawn. The oceans glowed under softer light, and in that glow, the stage was being set for complexity to take root. Even the colors of the seas would have shifted. With less ultraviolet slicing through, the waters reflected and refracted sunlight differently. Their blues deepened, their greens shimmered with new richness. In the clarity of these oceans, the story of life's resilience shone, painted across every ripple and wave. And with this change came a subtle but profound freedom. Life was no longer bound to shadows. The safety of deeper waters was still home, but now the surface was becoming habitable too. The playground of the shallows, kissed by gentler rays, became a realm where experiments could flourish. Multicellular clusters that might once have perished in the sun's blaze could now linger longer, test themselves against the openness of light. Slowly, quietly, possibility expanded. The oceans had always been Earth's cradle, but now they were becoming something more. They were nurseries not only of survival, but of potential. In their softened light, the first hints of diversity stirred. Cells gathered in new ways, forming colonies that shimmered and drifted like the first constellations of complexity. The rhythm of tides, once merely a cycle of safety and danger, now pulsed with gentler opportunity. Above, the ozone shield thickened further. Below, the oceans bloomed. Together, they shaped a balance so fragile, so intricate, and yet so enduring that it would carry life forward toward futures unimaginable. The oceans, once scorched by unrelenting fire, had been transformed into shimmering havens. They glowed under light that was finally safe, light that whispered not only of endurance, but of growth. In that softened glow, life began to dream bigger dreams. For countless ages, the boundary between sea and land had been a place of peril. The coasts were bright, open, and exposed, where the sun's rays fell with their greatest intensity. Tidal flats glittered at dawn and dusk, warmed by shallow waters, yet beneath their beauty lurked danger. The ultraviolet blaze that fell unchecked from the sky made these edges a crucible too harsh for delicate life. Only the hardiest microbes, shielded within thick mats of slime, could endure brief moments at the boundary. The rest remained below, in safer depths, letting the shorelines stand empty of living presence. But with the gathering of the ozone veil, this story began to change. The invisible curtain above, woven of oxygen and sunlight, softened the fire that once seared the tidal world. The first safe shores emerged, fragile but real, washed in light that was still bright but no longer merciless. Imagine those ancient coastlines. The land was barren, a tapestry of stone and sand, without forests, without mosses, without the green threads of grass. Yet life was arriving there in its simplest form. Microbial mats crept outward with each tide, stretching themselves across rocks that were once too hostile to hold them. They spread like dark films across wet stone, catching sunlight, thriving in puddles that lingered when the sea withdrew. What had once been only barren shallows became streaked with color, greens, browns, golds, life painting the edges of continents in patterns of persistence. The tides themselves became allies in this expansion. Twice each day, the ocean spilled across the rocks, carrying microbes upward, letting them rest in shallow pools. Twice each day, the waters receded, leaving behind mats to endure the air. Before the ozone shield, these excursions had been dangerous, often fatal, the sun's rays tearing at fragile membranes. But now the air was softened, the sunlight filtered. Microbes that once perished in a few moments of exposure lingered longer, and those that lingered longer multiplied. There is a gentle rhythm in this story, the rhythm of tides teaching life to touch the land. With each cycle, the mats grew bolder, spreading further, enduring longer, until they became permanent fixtures of the shoreline. Their presence altered the rock itself, secreting films that trapped sediments, shaping microlandscapes, and leaving behind fossilized impressions that whisper their story even now. It was not a grand march onto land, not yet. The world of soil and air was still too barren, too raw for true colonization. But the first steps had been taken. The first safe shores had been claimed, not by towering plants or wandering creatures, but by films of life so thin they could be overlooked, and yet so powerful that they transformed the relationship between sea and land. From these mats rose whispers of possibility. The shoreline was no longer only a boundary to fear, but a threshold to explore. Each tide offered new opportunities, pools rich in nutrients, puddles warmed by the sun, surfaces where photosynthesis could flourish with newfound safety. The ozone shield, though still fragile, made these places habitable in ways they had never been before. To imagine this moment is to see resilience embodied. Picture barren coast, the rocks gleaming wet beneath the sun, and on them, faint films of green spreading quietly outward. They cling stubbornly, surviving where none had survived before, painting the edges of continents with life's determination. They are not dramatic to the eye, but they are profound in meaning. For these films are the ancestors of forests, of meadows, of every green thing that will one day cover the land. The cozy truth is that progress often begins small. The first safe shores were not lush gardens, not flourishing ecosystems, but delicate footholds. Yet in their quiet persistence, they carried the promise of all that was to come. Each patch of microbial life, spread thin across rock and tidal pools, was a thread in the tapestry of Earth's unfolding. They were the test stitches in the great quilt of life that would one day blanket continents in green. The land was still silent then, still waiting, but no longer empty, no longer untouched. The ozone veil had given the world its first safe edges, its first invitation to step onto land. And in that invitation, life began to accept, one film at a time, one tide at a time, one gentle inch toward the future. The first safe shores had been claimed, and in them, the story of Earth's transformation deepened. The Earth had always been a place of urgency. For billions of years, life existed on a knife's edge, each moment a contest against the unforgiving forces of the world. Ultraviolet radiation tore through cells, mutations piled upon mutations, and survival often depended not on thriving, but simply on endurance. Generations rose and fell like the tides, many extinguished before they had a chance to leave any mark. Evolution was a rapid, chaotic storm, shaped as much by destruction as by creativity. But with the coming of the ozone veil, a subtle shift took hold. The fire in the sky had been softened. No longer did ultraviolet light fall upon Earth with quite the same unrelenting ferocity. It was still there, still capable of harm, but now much of it was caught and tamed before it could strike. The sky, once a merciless judge, had become more forgiving, and in that forgiveness, life discovered something it had never truly known before: time. This was not time as in the turning of days and nights, for those had always been present. This was time in the sense of continuity, of stability, of the ability to pass from one generation to the next without constant interruption. Mutations still occurred. Indeed, they were the heartbeat of evolution, but fewer were catastrophic. DNA could stretch itself, experiment with form and function without being shredded at every turn. Evolution's hand grew steadier, less frantic, more deliberate. Imagine the comfort this brought if one could feel it, the chance for life to breathe more slowly, to test new shapes and patterns, to linger in possibility rather than scramble in desperation. Colonies of cells that once lived brief, fragile existences could now endure longer, forming more complex relationships with one another. Early multicellular bodies, once easily undone, had the space to strengthen, to test their bonds, to refine their cooperation. The ozone shield gave life a cushion, a buffer against the raw forces of the cosmos. It was as though a parent had leaned over cradle, pulling a quilt across the child within. The world outside was still wild, still dangerous, but within that protective covering, the child could rest, could grow, could dream. In this way, the ozone veil became not just a physical shield, but a womb of stability for the planet itself. And from that stability flowed innovation. Evolution, no longer pressed to rush in constant repair, could begin to explore more elaborate pathways. Proteins folded into more complex forms. Organisms developed internal compartments and more specialized parts. Cooperation between cells deepened, leading toward the first whispers of tissues and organs. Each step was tiny, each change slow, but together they formed a progression toward complexity that would have been impossible in a harsher world. There is a deep coziness in imagining this shift, for it speaks to the comfort of being unhurried. Life could linger now, could take its time. The frantic race of survival softened into a slower dance, one that allowed grace as well as resilience. It is much the same as a seed that falls in rich soil rather than barren ground. In the barren soil, it must fight desperately to live, and many seeds fail. But in the rich soil, cushioned by stability, the seed has the leisure to unfurl, to grow strong roots, to reach for the sun. So it was for life beneath the ozone veil. The ocean cradled this new rhythm. In the softened light, mats of microbes spread wider, blooms of photosynthetic life brightened the shallows, and multicellular clusters grew stronger. Generations stretched longer, and in those longer generations, nature's experiments had time to refine themselves. Traits that once flickered briefly before being extinguished now had a chance to stabilize, to become part of the enduring story. And all the while, the ozone continued its patient weaving above. Each day, sunlight both threatened and protected, both tore and stitched, both burned and softened. The shield was dynamic, never static, constantly formed and reformed. Yet its presence meant continuity, and continuity meant progress. Evolution's slow breath filled the seas. Where once life gasped against the searing sky, now it inhaled more deeply, exhaled more patiently. The rhythm of existence shifted, from survival alone to survival with growth. The earth itself seemed to sigh in relief, as though the weight of danger had lessened, as though the stage had finally been set for the next act in the story. In that long breath, in that gift of time, lay the promise of everything yet to come. High above the seas, where the air thinned into silence and the sun's brilliance fell in invisible streams, something unseen kept watch. It was not a creature, not a mind, not anything that could think or choose, and yet in its quiet persistence, it behaved like a guardian, shielding what lay below from harm. It was Ozone, O3, fragile in its bonds yet strong in its purpose, a sentinel born from the breath of the smallest lives and the fire of the sun. For billions of years, Earth had been left exposed, a child beneath an open sky, unprotected against the radiance of its star. The sun gave generously, pouring warmth and energy across the planet, but within that generosity lay cruelty. Ultraviolet rays fell like invisible spears, unmaking what they touched. Life huddled in shadows, hid in the depths, survived by retreating from the light. There was no guardian then, no one to soften the blows, no one to hold back the storm. But with Ozone's arrival, that changed. The shield it offered was not absolute. It could not banish every harmful ray, but it absorbed enough, blunted enough, to make the difference between life ending and life enduring. Like a cloak spread across the shoulders of the planet, Ozone's presence gave comfort without being seen, protection without being praised. It was the kind of guardian that works in silence, that never announces itself, but whose absence would mean devastation. Imagine the world then, from the perspective of a single colony of microbes clinging to a rocky shore. They could not know the sky had changed. They could not name the guardian above, but they could feel its gift in the gentleness of sunlight that touched their membranes, in the reduced sting of radiation that once tore their DNA. They could linger in the shallows longer, spread further along the rocks, multiply in places they had never dared before. The guardian was invisible, but its influence was written in their survival. There is something profoundly cozy in thinking of ozone this way, not as a lifeless molecule, but as a presence that enfolds the world in safety. It asks for nothing in return. It simply exists, tirelessly, forming and reforming, broken and remade with every stroke of sunlight. It does not tire, does not falter, does not stop. And in its ceaseless vigilance, it gave life what it had always lacked: the security to grow. The Guardian's work was humble. Each molecule of ozone lasted only a short while before being torn apart by sunlight, scattered into oxygen atoms once more. Yet even in its destruction, the Guardian fulfilled its duty. For every time an ozone molecule was broken, it had already absorbed a ray of ultraviolet light, a ray that might have otherwise scorched the world below. In its breaking, it protected. In its fragility, it was strong. The sky itself became the Guardian's dwelling, a great, unseen fortress spread across the planet. No wall of stone, no fortress of steel could compare, for this shield was everywhere, over oceans and coasts, over barren land and mountain heights. It wrapped the earth like a cloak, unseen but unbroken. Within it, life stirred more boldly, no longer only enduring, but beginning to dream of expansion. And though ozone had no mind, no awareness, it played the role of protector more faithfully than any watchful sentinel. Its presence was steady, its patience eternal. It had no need to rest, no need to be thanked. It simply was. And in being, it safeguarded the fragile beginnings of complexity, the tentative experiments of multicellular life, the delicate threads of evolution weaving themselves into new forms. There is a warmth in this thought, that a world so raw and perilous could, through nothing more than chemistry, gain a guardian so profound. It is a reminder that safety often comes not from sudden miracles, but from quiet persistence, from the accumulation of small acts repeated endlessly. The ozone shield was not a gift given all at once. It was earned across millions of years, molecule by molecule, as the breath of microbes and the brilliance of the sun conspired to form a barrier of protection. Beneath that barrier, life carried on in ignorance of its blessing. Microbes multiplied, mats thickened, colonies of cells clung together more tightly. None of them could lift their gaze to the sky and recognize their guardian. None could whisper gratitude for the protection they received. And yet the guardian remained, unwavering, watching always, absorbing always, cradling the fragile spark of life until it could grow strong enough to flourish. In this way, ozone became more than a molecule. It became the silent guardian of Earth, a watchful presence that would remain through ages upon ages, ensuring that when the time came, the planet would be ready for forests, for creatures, for all the intricate wonders of life yet to come. The Earth had always been exposed, a fragile sphere adrift in the vastness of space. For billions of years, it had been like a child without a blanket, lying under the glare of an unsoftened sun, warmed and yet wounded by its light. But now, something remarkable was taking shape. Molecule by molecule, ozone was weaving itself into a covering stretched across the sky, and with that covering, the planet was no longer naked against the cosmos. It was becoming a quilted world, wrapped in a protective fabric stitched out of air and light. Picture this quilt as you might picture one folded across a bed, crafted not in a day but over time, with each square patiently sewn into place. The squares were molecules, fragile on their own, fleeting and easily torn apart. Yet together, countless millions of them formed a patchwork that stretched from horizon to horizon. The patches were never permanent. They were constantly unstitched and sewn anew, destroyed and rebuilt by the very light they sought to temper. But in that endless rhythm of undoing and remaking, the quilt endured. It was not yet seamless. Like any handmade covering, it began with gaps and holes, places where the harshness of ultraviolet light still slipped through. And yet, even with its imperfections, the quilt mattered. It dimmed the fire of the sun just enough to allow life below to breathe more deeply, to rest a little longer in the open. It softened the bite of day, transforming raw brilliance into a glow that nurtured rather than seared. The quilt was not something that life could see, but it was something they felt in their survival. Microbial mats that spread across shallow waters lingered longer now, their films of slime reaching further onto rocks and tidal flats. Stromatolites rose higher, basking in the softened light. Multicellular clusters, fragile experiments in cooperation, endured more generations than they once had. The quilt above cradled them all, unrecognized but indispensable. There is a coziness in imagining the entire planet wrapped this way, as though Earth itself were being tucked in for a long rest beneath the stars. The cosmos was vast, cold and merciless, but within the folds of the ozone quilt, Earth glowed gently, sheltered from the worst of the sun's fire. Like a child beneath a handmade covering stitched by generations of loving hands, the planet was cared for, even if the care came not from intention, but from chemistry. This quilt was not uniform, and that too gave it character. Just as a quilt made of scraps bears many colors and textures, the ozone layer shifted in density and strength across the globe. In some places it was thick, in others thin, but overall it offered a blanket of protection wide enough to change the story of life. It was imperfect, and yet it was enough. And as time passed, the stitching grew steadier. The more oxygen filled the air, the more material the quilt had to work with. The patches overlapped, the gaps grew smaller, the covering thickened. The stratosphere became not only a loom as it had been before, but a workshop of constant mending, where the quilt of ozone was repaired again and again with every dawn. Each day's sunlight might tear holes, but each day's breath of microbes filled them once more. This is the paradox of the ozone quilt. It was always temporary, always in motion, and yet across millions of years, it was enduring. Like a candle flame that is constantly destroyed and reborn, the quilt's fabric was always being remade, and in that remaking, it persisted. The continuity lay not in any single molecule of ozone, but in the ceaseless process that kept the covering whole. The quilt did more than soften the sun. It gave the earth an identity. From afar, the planet now shimmered in familiar hues, its skies deepening blue, its oceans reflecting that richness. To look upon it from the darkness of space would have been to see not just a rocky world covered in water, but a world wrapped in a living garment. The quilted earth glowed like a home. Beneath that covering, life carried on unknowing. It never paused to marvel at its guardian. It never lifted its awareness to thank the sky. And yet, every colony of cells, every layer of microbial mat, every cluster of multicellular cooperation lived longer and stronger because of it. The quilt asked for no recognition. It gave its gift quietly, endlessly, molecule by molecule. There is comfort in knowing that the smallest of things, molecules of gas drifting in the upper air, could stitch together something so vast and so vital. Comfort in knowing that the earth was not left naked beneath its star, but clothed, however imperfectly, in a quilt that offered warmth and safety. Comfort in knowing that this quilt still wraps the world today, a gift from the breath of the ancients, a covering we live under without thought each time we step into the sun. The earth had become a quilted planet, and beneath its covering, life was preparing for wonders yet to come. The story of life before the ozone shield was one of fragility. Every advance was threatened, every experiment in form and function shadowed by the relentless fire of the sky. Ultraviolet radiation did not discriminate. It struck every shoreline, every tidal pool, every shallow bloom with equal cruelty. DNA unraveled beneath its touch, membranes tore, and fragile colonies perished before they had time to build their strength. Survival was possible, but stability was elusive. But with the rise of ozone above, the world began to settle. The shield was imperfect, forever torn and mended anew, but its presence transformed the balance of existence. For the first time in Earth's long history, there was a measure of consistency. Days came and went, and though the sun still burned brightly, its bite was softened. Organisms that survived one sunrise had a better chance of surviving the next. Colonies that stretched into new shallows could persist across generations. The chaos of survival gave way, little by little, to a rhythm of stability. Imagine the comfort this brought to the ocean's edge. Microbial mats no longer lived only in fear of sudden annihilation. Instead, they grew broader and thicker, layer upon patient layer, as though they could trust in tomorrow. Stromatolites rose higher, their forms standing longer against the tides. The first fragile threads of multicellularity stitched themselves together with greater confidence, cells binding and cooperating without being shredded as quickly by the sky. Life had always been resilient, but now resilience was joined by continuity, and continuity gave rise to innovation. The ozone shield gave Earth a gift greater than protection alone. It gave time in abundance. Where once survival had been short-lived, now lineages could stretch across longer spans, allowing the patient hand of evolution to guide them toward new forms. Mutations that once flickered briefly before being erased now endured, giving rise to adaptations that could be passed forward. Generations could build upon one another, creating not only endurance but progress. This stability reshaped the planet itself. The shallows grew crowded with life. Blooms of photosynthetic organisms painted the waters with green and gold, producing more oxygen in turn, which fed the sky with more ozone. It was a cycle that reinforced itself. More life meant more breath meant more shield, more shield meant more life. The planet became a feedback loop of stability, a cradle rocking more gently with each passing age. There is a coziness in this balance, in imagining the Earth as a great home settling into calm after eons of unrest. The quilt of ozone above did not silence the sun, but softened its voice, turning harshness into something manageable, predictable. Like curtains drawn across a window in a bright room, it allowed light to enter without overwhelming, creating an environment where one could live, thrive, and even rest. With stability came patience. Evolution no longer rushed in desperation, but explored with care. Cells experimented with structure, some forming protective walls, others developing ways to communicate, others binding together into larger collectives. This was not the rapid, chaotic survival of old, but a slow blossoming, nurtured by the continuity the ozone shield provided. The world was becoming a place not merely of endurance, but of creativity. From the perspective of the cosmos, the change was subtle. The Earth still turned beneath its star, its oceans still gleamed, its continents still stood barren. But within those oceans, in the hidden folds of mats and colonies, the seeds of complexity were being nurtured. They were nurtured not by chance, but by stability, the quiet assurance that tomorrow's light would be much like today's, that the sky would protect as much as it harmed. This gift of stability is one we rarely pause to honor, and yet it is the foundation of all life that follows. Without it, the Cambrian explosion of diversity would never have come. Without it, forests would never have stretched across continents. Without it, no creature would have dared to raise its head above water to breathe the air. The ozone shield gave Earth its first true constancy. It wrapped the planet in continuity, in predictability, in a gentle rhythm that replaced chaos with calm. And in that calm, life found not just safety, but the freedom to dream. Beneath the softened skies, in oceans bathed with gentler light, something extraordinary began to stir. For billions of years, life had existed in its simplest forms, single cells, alone or in colonies, multiplying in endless rhythm, each one carrying its own small world within. They had endured extremes, reshaped the atmosphere, and left their marks in stone, but still they remained solitary. Yet now, under the quilt of ozone, the time had come for a new kind of experiment, the rise of multicellularity. It did not begin with sudden grandeur. No creature leapt from the waves fully formed. Instead, it began with subtle acts of cooperation. Cells that had once lived side by side without connection began to bind together more firmly, to share their tasks, to trust in one another's presence. At first, these were little more than colonies, clusters drifting through the water, holding together loosely, breaking apart as easily as they had formed. But with stability above, with the sun's fire dimmed and the gift of time secured, these clusters endured longer, grew larger, and began to change. Imagine a cluster of cells, no larger than a grain of sand, drifting in a sunlit lagoon. For ages, such clusters would have been undone by ultraviolet light, scattered before they could discover what they might become. But now, beneath the ozone shield, they lingered. Within the safety of endurance, a few cells found advantage in remaining together. Some gathered food more efficiently, while others absorbed light. Some took the brunt of the environment's dangers, while those inside were sheltered. Slowly, imperceptibly, roles began to form. This was the beginning of cooperation, not imposed, not planned, but encouraged by the quiet hand of survival. The shielded world allowed for trial and error allowed for discovery. A cluster that endured longer produced more descendants, and those descendants inherited the tendency to cling together. Over time, those clusters grew more intricate, their cells beginning to specialize, to divide the labor of life among themselves. There is something profoundly cozy in this image, of small beings learning to live not alone but in community. It is not unlike a village forming out of scattered households, each member finding strength in the group. Where once existence had been solitary, now it became shared. Where once the struggle had been endured in isolation, now it was carried together. And in that togetherness, the seeds of complexity were sown. The oceans began to shimmer with these new collectives. They were still fragile, still small, still unnoticed in the vastness of time, but they represented a turning point. The gift of stability provided by the ozone shield gave them the chance to persist long enough to refine themselves. Evolution could now explore paths that had once been closed, shaping life, not only as individuals, but as assemblies. It is worth pausing here to imagine the patience of it. There was no rapid explosion, no sudden bloom. It was a slow weaving, cell by cell, cluster by cluster, carried forward across millions of years. The quilt above gave its protection, the oceans gave their nutrients, and within those conditions, life wove itself into something new. Some clusters developed protective outer layers, shielding inner cells from harm. Others formed hollow spheres, with some cells inside and others outside, each playing a different role. These were the first steps toward tissue, the first faint outlines of structure. Though still microscopic, these collectives hinted at the vast diversity to come: organisms with organs, bodies with limbs, creatures capable of walking, flying, thinking. But here, at the dawn of multicellularity, the story was still quiet. It was a story told in the gentle drift of tiny colonies through softened waters, in the patience of cells learning to share their lives. It was a story of cooperation nurtured by stability, of complexity born not in haste, but in calm. And though none could know it, the gentle rise of multicellularity would reshape the future of Earth. The forests, the animals, the civilizations, all were hidden within these first collectives, waiting to unfold. Their story began in coziness, in the soft glow of filtered light, beneath a quilted sky that gave them time enough to grow. The Earth had always glowed with sunlight. From the first moment its skies cleared after the chaos of formation, the golden warmth of the sun had poured across its surface, filling the oceans with brilliance and stirring the cycles of wind and tide. But that glow had long been double-edged, for within its beauty hid a sharpness, an invisible edge of ultraviolet fire that burned the fragile chemistry of life. The seas shimmered, but they shimmered with danger. The glow was not safe. And yet, with the coming of the ozone veil, the nature of sunlight began to change. The brilliance did not vanish. The sun was as strong as ever, a star unchanging in its generosity. But now its harshness has softened. Its bite was blunted. What once seared and destroyed now arrived as warmth and radiance. The glow remained, but it was a glow transformed, no longer a threat, but a comfort. Imagine drifting as a tiny cell in the upper layers of a lagoon, rising on currents to meet the sunlit surface. Once, such a journey would have been perilous, the light above promising energy but delivering pain. A few moments too close to the surface could mean ruin, DNA torn apart by ultraviolet strikes. But now, beneath the ozone's protection, the surface shimmered with invitation. The glow of sunlight was filtered, its fury dimmed, leaving only the richness of light that fed photosynthesis. The cell could bask longer and could linger without retreat. The glow was no longer cruel, it was safe. Across the oceans, this change was felt in countless small ways. Microbial mats spread wider in tidal flats, no longer scorched as quickly when waters receded. Stromatolites, rising slowly over centuries, reached higher into the shallows, their tops bathing in a sun that nurtured instead of punished. Multicellular clusters drifted more confidently near the surface, no longer forced to sink deep into shadows to avoid annihilation. The glow of safety touched them all, opening a new range of possibilities. The change was not only practical but atmospheric. The very mood of the Earth shifted. The sky above had deepened into a richer blue, a gentler hue, and the waters beneath it reflected that calm. Sunlight shimmered across waves with a softness that had not been there before, painting the seas in golds and silvers that felt less like fire and more like embrace. The Earth was beginning to look and to feel like a home. There is something profoundly cozy in imagining this. The first living things basking without fear, warmed by a sun that no longer punished them. They could not name their comfort, could not recognize the ozone curtain stretched above, but they experienced it nonetheless in their survival, their persistence, their freedom to reach for the light. The glow of safety was the gift they received, a gift stitched silently into the sky by molecules that formed and dissolved endlessly, asking for no recognition. The glow also carried continuity. Days no longer brought such abrupt swings between survival and devastation. The sun rose, and its light, though bright, remained manageable. Organisms grew accustomed to this stability, to the gentleness of a shielded world. Generations passed, each one building more securely on the last. What once had been fleeting was now enduring. What once had been frantic was now calm. And in that calm, beauty unfolded. The seas glistened with blooms of photosynthetic life, coloring the shallows in rich greens and golds. Patterns of light danced across rocks and sand, patterns that life itself mirrored in its growing complexity. The glow of safety was more than just physical, it was creative. It invited life to linger, to experiment, to grow bolder. It set the stage for everything to come. The ozone veil did not erase danger, for the Earth was still a wild place, its skies stormy, its continents barren, its seas shifting with tides and currents. But it added something new to the balance: trust. Life could trust the light in a way it never had before. It could drift toward the surface without dread, stretch into the shallows without collapse, and breathe more steadily into the rhythm of the day. The glow of safety was not just a change in light, but a change in feeling. It was the first time the planet whispered reassurance to its children: you may come closer, you may rest here, you may grow. And though those whispers were inaudible, though no creature then could understand them, they were written into survival, into persistence, into the great story of evolution. The Earth glowed as it always had, but now, beneath its quilted sky, the glow had become gentle, kind, and safe. For so long, the Earth had been a place of survival alone. Its oceans held life in abundance, but that life was simple, fragile, and bound by limits. The skies were harsh, the land barren, the seas perilous in their shallows. But now, with the ozone veil growing above, the planet itself seemed to change its posture. It was as though Earth, after billions of years of turmoil, was tidying itself, softening its edges, readying its home for company it knew was on the way. The ozone layer was not merely a shield, it was a preparation. With its gathering strength, the atmosphere became less hostile, less chaotic. Sunlight that once burned mercilessly was tempered, turned into something more nurturing. This steadiness was not only a gift for the creatures alive then, it was a foundation laid for those who had yet to come. Imagine Earth as a host, long before its guests arrive, setting its table with quiet care. The oceans are the great banquet hall, vast and shimmering. The atmosphere is the ceiling, now draped in a protective canopy of ozone. The light pouring in through that canopy has shifted from cruel brilliance to a golden glow, softer, warmer, safer. The stage is being arranged for a feast of diversity, though the feast itself is still millions of years away. On the shores, microbial mats stretch themselves outward as though testing the linens. In the shallows, stromatolites stand like centerpieces, layered and patient, catching the light. In the open seas, tiny multicellular clusters drift like flickering candles, faint but growing in strength. They are not yet the grand guests Earth is preparing for, but they are the early arrivals, the hints of what is to come. The cozy truth of this chapter in Earth's story is that preparation is itself an act of care. The ozone veil did not arrive in haste. It was built molecule by molecule, day by day, over immense spans of time. Each oxygen molecule split and remade by sunlight was another stitch in the tablecloth, another fold of fabric smoothed across the table. Earth did not rush, for it had no need to. Its patience was endless, and in that patience, it made a home worthy of its future inhabitants. With the ozone in place, the world gained consistency. Harsh swings of ultraviolet intensity gave way to a steadier rhythm of days. Organisms that had once hidden in shadows could step into the light and linger. Multicellular experiments could refine themselves without being torn apart too soon. The safety of stability encouraged boldness, and boldness encouraged complexity. Life was beginning to expand, not simply endure. From space, the planet must have looked more welcoming now. The skies deepened in hue, the oceans shimmered with blooms of photosynthetic life, and the faint glow of oxygen and ozone began to mark Earth as something distinct. It was no longer a raw sphere of rock and water. It was a home, dressed in blues and greens, glowing softly as if by invitation. There is comfort in imagining Earth this way, not simply as a planet that happened to allow life, but as a host preparing for guests, laying out its best, making ready. The quilted ozone veil was not for the microbes alone, it was for the forests yet to grow, the creatures yet to walk, the voices yet to rise. The air was being prepared so lungs could breathe. The light was being softened so eyes could see. The land was being readied so roots could anchor, so feet could tread, so wings could one day catch the sky. Life at the time could not know the scale of this preparation. The mats and colonies went on with their patient rhythms, unaware that they were laying the foundations for all that would follow. Yet the Earth knew, in the way that only a planet can know, through the unfolding of chemistry and time, that it was becoming ready. The long prelude was drawing to a close, and soon the symphony of complexity would begin. The ozone veil was Earth's tablecloth, its canopy, its embrace. It transformed a world of peril into a world of promise. The guests were not yet here, but their arrival was certain. The Earth had prepared the hall, lit the candles, and spread the quilt across its skis. And when the moment came, it would welcome its guests with a glow of safety and a home made ready. From the very beginning, the sun had been both giver and taker. Its warmth stirred the oceans, its light fueled photosynthesis, but hidden within its brilliance was a sharpness, a cruel edge that had long dictated the terms of life. Ultraviolet radiation was relentless, an unseen flame that burned without fire, a force that shredded molecules and scarred the delicate codes of DNA. For billions of years, life had bent itself around this danger, retreating into shadows, sinking into depths, or wrapping itself in protective layers. The sun was to be respected, but also to be feared. And yet, as ozone gathered in the stratosphere, something miraculous unfolded. The fire was not extinguished, it could not be, but it was tamed. Ozone molecules absorbed the ultraviolet strikes, catching them like nets, breaking their force, and turning their energy into warmth rather than ruin. The radiation that once slashed through cells now dissipated harmlessly, lost in the endless rhythm of chemistry. The hunter had become harnessed, the destroyer subdued. Imagine the stratosphere as a great sieve, filtering the light of the sun. Through it, the golden rays of visible light passed freely, bathing the earth in warmth and brilliance. But the harshest threads, the ultraviolet spears, were caught in the weave, intercepted before they could reach the surface. What once pierced without mercy was now dulled, softened, transformed. The light that reached the seas was no longer a knife, but a gentle hand. This transformation changed everything. Life that had once been forced into defensive positions could now stretch upward toward the glow. Shallow waters, once deserts of danger, became nurseries. Multicellular clusters that once withered under the sun's fire now lingered, endured, and multiplied. Ultraviolet radiation, once the tyrant of the skis, was now a servant of balance, present, but no longer supreme. There is a profound coziness in this tamming, for it mirrors the way a wild flame, once dangerous, can be transformed into a hearth. A fire untamed devours forests, burns homes, destroys, but contained within a hearth, the same fire warms, comforts, sustains. So too with ultraviolet light. Once unchecked, it had been merciless, but now, filtered by ozone, it became manageable. It could no longer dominate, it could only contribute. The chemistry of this dance was constant, patient, and eternal. Sunlight tore apart oxygen molecules, releasing single atoms that found their way to O2 and formed ozone. Ozone absorbed the ultraviolet strike, splitting once again into O2 and an atom ready to recombine. Destruction and creation, creation and destruction, repeated endlessly. It was a cycle of balance, a rhythm that played out across the skis every day. The radiation had not disappeared. It had been woven into a pattern, made part of a system that was preserved rather than destroyed. From the perspective of the cosmos, the Earth glowed differently now. It shimmered with stability, its surface bathed in a softened light that made it stand out from the barren worlds nearby. Mars, without such a shield, remained stark and exposed. Venus, though wrapped in a thick atmosphere, held a sky too heavy, too hot. But Earth, clothed in its ozone veil, was learning how to cradle life. Radiation was no longer a wild tyrant, it was part of a home. For the organisms drifting in the seas, this tamming was salvation. Their generations stretched longer, their structures became more daring, their cooperation more intricate. The shield above had rewritten the rules, and under those new rules, complexity could unfold. The ultraviolet fire had not vanished, but it had been subdued into something livable, something that shaped without destroying. And so Earth breathed easier. Its skis glowed with a deeper blue, its oceans shimmered with a gentler light, and beneath the quilt of ozone, life inhaled more deeply, exhaled more patiently. The radiation that once scattered existence had been tamed, and in that tamming lay the promise of forests, of creatures, of civilizations yet to come. The fire of the sun had been transformed. It was no longer a foe to be fled, but a companion to be trusted, not in full, but enough. Enough for life to climb closer to the light. Enough for Earth to become not just habitable, but welcoming. With the sky softened by its quilt of ozone and the ultraviolet fire tamed into something gentler, the oceans began to shimmer with a new vitality. For ages, their surfaces had been places of caution, lit brightly but edged with danger. The sun's brilliance poured down, promising energy but often delivering ruin. But now, beneath the softened glow, the seas embraced the light. They opened their shallows to life, and life responded with abundance. The oceans bloomed again. The first signs of this renewal were subtle, faint glimmers of green drifting near the surface, colonies of photosynthetic organisms spreading further and lasting longer in the daylight. But as the shield above thickened, the blooms grew richer, larger, and more enduring. Vast swathes of microbial life painted the oceans with their color, filling tidal pools, lagoons, and shallow seas with living carpets that shimmered gold and green beneath the sun. From the surface, the planet itself seemed to glow differently, as though the oceans had learned how to mirror the sky's softened blue with their own vibrant hues. Every bloom was a chorus of breath. Each photosynthetic organism captured sunlight, transformed it into energy, and released oxygen as a gift to the air. That oxygen rose upward, drifting high into the stratosphere, where the sun's brilliance once again split it into atoms and remade it into ozone. With each cycle, the quilt above grew stronger, and with each strengthening of the quilt, the oceans bloomed more boldly still. It was a partnership, a feedback loop of resilience, a dance of air and sea that stitched safety into permanence. Imagine the sight: waters once sparse with life now thickened with blooms, each wave carrying swirls of color, each tide stirring clouds of photosynthetic organisms. These were not the great forests of kelp or the coral reefs of later ages, but they were beautiful in their own way, fields of microscopic life, so numerous they turned entire bays into glowing expanses. Their presence filled the atmosphere with oxygen, transforming the chemistry of the planet, fueling the ozone that shielded them in return. This was the Earth in harmony, a system where protection and productivity fed each other endlessly. The more the oceans bloomed, the more oxygen filled the skis. The more oxygen filled the skis, the stronger the ozone became. The stronger the ozone, the safer the oceans were to bloom again. The cycle spun quietly, patiently, building stability upon stability, weaving safety into abundance. There is something deeply cozy in this picture, of oceans and skis working together, of life and chemistry entwined, of protection giving rise to abundance, and abundance reinforcing protection. It is the very essence of a home, a place where every part sustains the others, where growth does not threaten survival, but strengthens it. For the life drifting in these waters, the difference was profound. Colonies that once withered quickly in harsh sunlight now flourished for longer seasons. Stromatolites grew taller, layer upon layer, their forms reaching proudly toward the light. Multicellular clusters multiplied more confidently, finding more opportunities to test cooperation and complexity. The oceans became not just a cradle of survival, but a workshop of creativity. From space, had there been eyes to see, Earth would have gleamed more vibrantly than before. Its seas, enriched with oxygen-producing blooms, shimmered with brilliance, their colors shifting with the seasons, their productivity sending whispers of change into the air. The planet was beginning to shine with life in a way that no other world in the solar system could match. The oceans had bloomed before, in earlier ages, but always cautiously, always under the threat of annihilation from the sun's harshness. Now, under the quilt of ozone, they bloomed with trust, and that trust was transformative. It laid the groundwork for ecosystems more elaborate, for life that did more than endure, life that thrived, multiplied, and prepared for futures far beyond what the waters alone could contain. The blooms were not dramatic to a human eye, no vast forests yet swayed, no animals yet swam, but they were the first great flourishing of life under a protected sky. They were the Earth's way of breathing more deeply, exhaling strength into the atmosphere, exhaling safety into itself. The oceans had bloomed again, and with their bloom, the Earth's story shifted once more. For billions of years before the ozone veil, the sky had been remembered as harsh. It was written into the very chemistry of life: stay hidden, stay low, survive in the shadows. Generations upon generations of microbes carried this memory in their patterns, in their instincts, in the invisible rules that guided their survival. To drift too close to the surface was to risk destruction. To linger too long in the shallows was to invite ruin. The sky had been a thing to fear. But now, with ozone gathering above, the memory of the sky began to change. Slowly, across countless cycles of life and death, a new inheritance took shape, an inheritance of safety. Creatures born into this world found that the surface was not as perilous as it had been. Where their ancestors had fled, they could endure. Where once they had hidden, they could rise. The shift was so gradual it could not be marked in a single lifetime, but over ages it became undeniable. The sky was no longer a tyrant. It had become something kinder. Imagine a mat of microbes spreading across a sunlit rock in the shallows. In ages past, they would have dried and burned within moments, leaving only faint traces behind. But now, the filtered light allowed them to linger. A new generation grew where once none could. Their survival, repeated and repeated, became a memory passed down not in thought, but in chemistry, in adaptation, in the quiet shaping of evolution. Over time, the very patterns of life began to reflect trust in the softened sky. This was not memory as humans understand it, not recollection, not stories whispered by elders, but a biological memory written into genes, into habits, into survival itself. The shield above altered the story that life carried forward. What had once been written as fear the light was slowly rewritten as reach for the light. The ozone veil was invisible, but its presence was etched into every lineage, carried forward by every descendant. There is a cozy reassurance in imagining this change, as though the earth itself were teaching its children to breathe more easily. The harsh lessons of the past were not erased. The danger of ultraviolet rays was still real, still waiting in moments when the shield thinned. But the balance had shifted, and with it, the deep memory of the sky was transformed. Life could grow with less fear, with more confidence, with the expectation of safety. The new memory of the sky was also a memory of time. With less constant destruction, organisms could endure across more generations, building continuity. The rhythms of survival slowed into rhythms of growth. For the first time, patterns could stretch across millions of years without being entirely reset by devastation. The shield had not only softened the light, it had softened the tempo of evolution, giving life the chance to compose a longer, richer song. Imagine, if you will, the earth from far above. Clouds drift across blue skies, oceans gleam beneath them, and beneath the waters life stirs in new ways. None of it is conscious of the guardian above, none of it can give thanks, and yet all of it carries the benefit in its being. The ozone veil has become part of the planet's memory, part of its inheritance, part of the gentle promise passed from one generation to the next. You may live here, you may grow here, you are safer than before. The cozy truth is that every living thing today carries that memory still. When we look up at the blue dome above us, when we breathe the air, when we bask in sunlight without fear of being destroyed, we are experiencing the gift written long ago into the story of life. The ozone shield is not just a layer in the sky, it is a memory of care, of protection, of safety repeated across ages until it became part of who we are. The earth had given its children a new sky, and with it, a new memory, one of trust, of continuity, and of a future that could be brighter than the past. The Proterozoic world was quiet compared to the dramas that lay ahead. Its oceans shimmered with microbial life, its coasts were traced with films of mats, its skies were deepening into a steady blue beneath the quilt of ozone. It was a time of preparation, of foundations being laid, of subtle changes whose significance would only be revealed later. The earth was not yet bursting with forests or creatures, not yet resounding with the clamor of diversity, but in its stillness, it was preparing. The ozone veil was central to this preparation. For countless ages, the sun had been a gatekeeper, allowing life only in shadows and depths. But now that its harshness was softened, the gates were beginning to open. The earth had, in a sense, unlocked a new level of potential. The shield above was not only protecting what existed, but also creating the conditions for what would come. It was like a room being prepared before guests arrived, every surface polished, every corner arranged, the air freshened and made ready. The guests were still far away, but their coming was certain. Imagine the oceans in this time, vast, calm expanses shimmering under safe light. To our eyes, they might have seemed empty, but in truth they were filled with invisible promise. Multicellular clusters drifted in their shallows, fragile and tentative, but now able to endure long enough to experiment with form. Some became hollow spheres, others elongated threads, others simple discs. They were not yet animals, not yet plants, but they carried within them the seeds of both. Each was a shadow of tomorrow, a faint sketch of shapes that would one day stride, swim, and bloom across the planet. The ozone shield gave these experiments something precious: continuity. Without constant annihilation from ultraviolet light, lineages could persist across generations, allowing complexity to accumulate. A structure that worked could be repeated. A pattern that gave advantage could be refined. This continuity was the soil in which diversity could someday flourish. The Earth was not yet ready for the Cambrian Explosion, but it was laying the groundwork with patient care. There is something cozy in this long anticipation, in the thought that even as life went about its simple existence, the planet was preparing surprises for its children. The quilt of ozone was a gift not just for the present, but for the future. It was Earth saying, "You may not yet know what you are capable of, but when the time comes, you will have the protection you need to flourish." From space, the Earth still looked serene, a blue world with barren continents, clouds drifting slowly, oceans glowing softly beneath a kind sky. There were no forests to catch the eye, no creatures to stir the waters. And yet, hidden within the currents and shallows, the outlines of the future were being drawn. The shadows of tomorrow were everywhere, in colonies testing cooperation, in cells learning specialization, in ecosystems stabilized by the gentler light. The Cambrian was still millions of years away, but it was foreshadowed in these quiet waters. Every oxygen bubble released by a photosynthetic bloom, every stitch of ozone formed in the stratosphere, every generation of microbes that endured under safer skies was part of the preparation. The Earth was setting the stage, dimming the harsh lights, softening the air, and waiting. The cozy truth is that great changes are often preceded by long silences. Before the chorus, there is always a hush. Before the explosion, there is always a breath. The Proterozoic, wrapped in its ozone veil, was that hush, that breath, that stillness before the symphony. And so, beneath the softened sky, the shadows of tomorrow lengthened, invisible to the life that stirred then but clear to us now. The quilt of ozone was not only a guardian of the present, it was a promise of the future. From the darkness of space, Earth turned slowly, a jewel adrift in the black. To an ancient watcher, if one had hovered nearby, the planet would have gleamed with a beauty unlike any other in the solar system. Mars was pale and red, dry and quiet. Venus was shrouded in veils of cloud, brilliant but suffocating. But Earth was alive with color, with motion, with a shimmer that spoke of water and sky. And now, with its ozone quilt stretched across the heavens, Earth carried a new depth, a new softness, a new promise. It was a world wrapped in blue. The color of the skies had deepened as the ozone layer grew strong. What had once been a thin, sharp brightness became a richer, calmer blue stretching dome-like above the oceans. That blue was not only beautiful, it was protective. It was the visible face of chemistry working in silence, of molecules absorbing invisible fire, so that the light that reached the surface could be gentle, nurturing. To see the Earth from afar was to see not just a planet, but a world dressed in safety. The oceans mirrored the sky, gleaming with their own hues of sapphire, turquoise, and green. Together, the sea and sky created a harmony of color that gave the Earth its identity. This was no barren sphere of rock, no lifeless husk. This was a home, shimmering with balance, dressed in blue as though in celebration of what it had become. The ozone veil had not simply made the planet habitable, it had made it beautiful. Imagine drifting above the Earth at this time, looking down as it spun. Clouds swirled in white ribbons across the blue, casting shifting shadows on the seas below. Sunlight glanced off waves, scattering brilliance into the atmosphere, softened by ozone into a glow that reached the eye without harshness. The land remained barren, rocky, and silent, but even in its emptiness, it was part of the composition, streaks of brown and gray set against the symphony of blue and white. It was a beauty that came not from abundance of life, but from preparation. The Earth was not yet filled with forests, not yet resounding with animal calls, but it was already radiant, already carrying within its colors the promise of what was to come. The ozone veil gave the planet a face recognizable to us, the deep blue sky, the shimmering seas, the protective atmosphere glowing faintly at the edges when sunlight caught it. It was a face that said, "I am ready." Beneath that blue covering, life continued in its quiet persistence. Microbial mats stretched across shallows, stromatolites rose patiently, multicellular clusters drifted in the softened light. They did not know the beauty of the sky above, did not gaze upward in wonder. And yet their very survival was tied to it. They breathed in its safety, basked in its glow, thrived in its stability. The Earth's blue cloak was not for eyes to admire, but for life to endure. There is something profoundly cozy in this thought, that our planet's beauty is inseparable from its safety. The same processes that deepened the sky's blue and made the oceans shimmer were the ones that shielded life from harm. Beauty and protection were one and the same. The Earth was not just habitable, it was wrapped in an aesthetic of care, clothed in a radiance that was both practical and comforting. From the vastness of the universe, Earth's blue glow became its signature, its identity, its quiet announcement of uniqueness. Among the barren worlds and gas giants, here was a place clothed in color, softened by chemistry, alive with potential. It was the look of a world that had prepared itself for company, a world wrapped in blue. The quilt of ozone stitched across the stratosphere did more than block radiation. It gave the Earth a new face, a new presence, a new serenity. The planet turned beneath the sun, glowing gently, a home dressed not in rawness but in grace. And within that glow, the seeds of future forests, creatures, and civilizations waited patiently, sheltered until their time came. Earth was wrapped in blue, and in that wrapping, it was ready to welcome tomorrow. Beneath the softened skies and the gleaming oceans, the true architects of Earth's transformation continued their work in quiet obscurity. They were not mighty trees reaching toward the heavens, nor creatures with eyes and voices. They were the smallest of builders, the hidden laborers of the Proterozoic world, cyanobacteria, algae-like organisms, and their microbial kin. It was their breath that filled the air with oxygen. It was their endless, patient labor that made the ozone veil possible. They asked for nothing. They sought no recognition. They simply lived, dividing, spreading, catching sunlight, weaving the chemistry of existence into cycles of life. Yet in their simplicity lay greatness. For every bubble of oxygen that slipped upward from a microbial mat, every sigh of gas released from a stromatolite, every microscopic breath drifting into the atmosphere was a stitch in the fabric of the ozone shield. Molecule by molecule, the smallest of beings crafted the safety of the largest. Imagine one of these mats in the shallows, a green-brown film spread across wet rock, glistening beneath the sun. To our eyes, it might seem humble, even unremarkable, but within it, countless cells worked tirelessly, capturing photons, splitting water molecules, forging energy. Each cell carried out a rhythm that seemed small, but when multiplied across billions upon billions of lives, it reshaped the entire planet. The mats were not mere slime. They were the forgers of the atmosphere, the artisans of the sky. The Earth's quilt of ozone was not a sudden miracle. It was a gift crafted slowly, patiently, over ages uncounted. And that gift was built by these hidden workers. They did not intend it. They did not know what they were making. And yet, by living, they gave. Their gift was survival not for themselves alone, but for all who would come after. There is something profoundly cozy in honoring these builders, these silent workers who carried the weight of the world without awareness. Their story is a reminder that greatness often arises not from drama or spectacle, but from persistence, from small acts repeated endlessly. The shield that wrapped the Earth in blue was not forged in fire or thunder, but in the quiet shimmer of microbes basking in sunlight, exhaling breath after breath, until the sky itself was transformed. Stromatolites still stand today in a few quiet corners of the world, fossil and living alike, monuments to this ancient labor. They rise from shallow waters, layered towers of stone and life, each ring a record of patient work. They are the archives of the builders, the visible marks of their otherwise invisible toil. To walk among them today is to step into the presence of the ancestors who crafted our air, our sky, our safety. If the Earth itself could give thanks, it would sing to these builders. If the skies could speak, they would whisper gratitude for the breath that became their shield. And though life then could not honor them, we can now, knowing what their work achieved. Every forest that would one day grow, every creature that would one day breathe, every voice that would one day speak owes its existence to the labor of the smallest, the most humble. The hidden builders did not reign, they did not conquer, they did not announce themselves, and yet they were the most influential of all. They gave Earth its oxygen, its ozone, its blue skies, its stability. They gave Earth the possibility of tomorrow. And so, beneath the quilt of ozone, let us pause in this story to honor them. the invisible artisans of the atmosphere, the silent masons of survival, the hidden builders who worked without knowing, and in doing so, made a home for us all. The Earth has always been suspended between two realms. Above stretched the infinite darkness of space, vast, cold, and merciless, where stars burned and worlds drifted in silence. Below, in the seas and on the rocks, life stirred, fragile, delicate, and tender. For billions of years, there was little to divide these realms. The sky was thin, the sunlight poured in unchecked, and the line between safety and danger was faint. The cosmos pressed hard upon the cradle of life, and survival meant retreat into depths, into shadows, into narrow refuges. But with the gathering of ozone, a veil was drawn between these worlds. It was not thick, not impenetrable. In fact, it was astonishingly thin, a gossamer fabric stretched across the stratosphere, no thicker than the width of a fingertip if gathered into one layer at sea level. And yet, for all its delicacy, it was mighty. It was the veil that marked the difference between a barren world and a living one, between oceans of silence and oceans of bloom. This veil absorbed the blows of the cosmos. Ultraviolet radiation, fierce and unrelenting, struck it with invisible spears. Each strike was caught, intercepted by an ozone molecule, and transformed into warmth instead of ruin. The veil did not block the sun's gift of light, it merely softened it, keeping the nurturing rays while tempering the cruelest. Above the veil, the cosmos remained raw and merciless. Below it, life unfolded in safety. Imagine looking upward on such a world. To the eye, the veil was invisible, hidden in the blue of the sky, but it was there, stretched wide, draped across the planet like a protective covering. To those in the oceans, the safety it gave could not be named, but it was felt in every moment of persistence. It was the difference between hiding and growing, between retreating and venturing upward. The veil was not something life could touch, but it was something life could trust. There is a quiet coziness in thinking of this veil, a reminder that boundaries need not be walls of stone or steel to matter. Sometimes they are made of softness, of thinness, of fragility that holds great strength. The ozone layer was such a boundary, a liminal space where destruction was caught and repurposed, where chaos was tempered into calm. It was the seam that stitched together two worlds, the cosmos above and the biosphere below. In this way, the Earth became divided but also unified. The veil did not separate to isolate, it separated to protect. It marked out a safe interior where life could deepen its roots, stretch its forms, and prepare to flourish. Beyond it, the universe continued its endless blaze, but within it, Earth glowed with security. It was like curtains drawn across the window of a nursery. Outside lay the night, vast and cold, but inside lay warmth, protection, and the quiet breath of growth. From space, the Earth appeared whole, glowing blue and white, serene. But hidden in that serenity was the veil, tirelessly working, endlessly weaving, unseen yet essential. Without it, the planet would have been scoured clean of its promise. With it, the Earth carried forward, clothed in a balance that made futures possible. The cozy truth is that we live still beneath this veil. We walk in its shelter, breathe in its safety, and look up through it every time we gaze at the blue sky. It is the boundary between worlds, the harsh cosmos, and the tender Earth, and in its presence, our planet has been allowed to dream. The veil between worlds held firm, and beneath it, life prepared for tomorrow. The ozone veil had begun as scattered wisps, fragile threads woven in sunlight's fire. For millions upon millions of years, it had been a patchwork, torn, mended, undone, and remade in endless rhythm. But as the Proterozoic stretched toward its close, the weaving grew steadier, thicker, and more complete. The Earth, once a fragile child beneath an unguarded sky, was now dressed fully in its quilt of protection. The final weaving was nearly done. The process had never ceased. Each day, oxygen released by microbial mats rose skyward, drifting into the stratosphere. Each day, ultraviolet rays struck, breaking oxygen apart, recombining it into ozone. Each day, that ozone absorbed more of the fire and softened more of the light. But what had once been scattered strands became, by this time, a tapestry so broad and enduring that the planet itself was transformed. The shield was no longer tentative, it had become lasting. The sky reflected this change. Its blue deepened into the steady hue we know today, a color not just of scattering light, but of safety secured. Clouds wandered through its dome, white against azure, carrying rains that nourished the shallows below. To look upon it, then would be to see a planet not in peril, but in readiness, a world that had woven its garment of protection fully around itself. The oceans too bore witness. Under this stronger veil, life flourished more boldly. Blooms of photosynthetic organisms spread across the seas, painting them in shifting shades of green and gold. Multicellular forms lingered longer, tested more daring shapes, pressed the boundaries of what survival could mean. The continuity offered by the ozone shield allowed lineages to persist long enough for complexity to take root. What had begun as whispers of cooperation now hinted at the symphony to come. Imagine Earth in this time, seen from afar, a sphere wrapped in blue, with swirling clouds above glistening oceans, a sight familiar to us, though the continents remained barren and the forests had not yet risen. It looked ready, dressed and waiting, its stage set for the Cambrian explosion of diversity that would soon unfold. The final weaving of ozone was not merely a scientific event. It was a planetary act of preparation, as if the Earth had pulled its quilt snug around its shoulders before opening its doors to life's great flourishing. There is something profoundly cozy in this image, the thought of the Earth finishing its long, patient stitching, molecule by molecule, until its quilt was whole. No grand hand guided it, no sudden miracle announced it. It was the result of persistence, the breath of microbes, the fire of sunlight, the rhythm of chemistry repeated endlessly until safety was secured. The final weaving was an act of patience, of quiet determination written across ages. And with that weaving, the Earth was no longer fragile, it was resilient. It was no longer only a cradle, it was a home. Its skis no longer threatened but welcomed. Its light no longer burned but nurtured. Its shield was strong, and within its embrace, the story of life could take its next great leap. The Proterozoic had been long, a time of subtle changes and patient preparation, but by its close, the stage was set. The ozone veil, once tentative, was now enduring. The final stitches were in place, the quilt complete. The Earth stood wrapped in its blue garment, steady and secure, ready for tomorrow's dawn. The Proterozoic Eon had been long, stretching across nearly 2 billion years of patience and preparation. It was not an age of spectacle, but of foundations, a time when the quietest processes, the most unassuming lives, and the subtlest balances reshaped the planet forever. By its end, Earth was no longer a raw sphere of seas and barren rock. It was a home dressed in blue, wrapped in its quilt of ozone, and poised at the edge of transformation. The ozone shield stood as one of the great achievements of this age. What had begun as scattered wisps high in the stratosphere had thickened into a stable veil, a guardian that endured day after day, year after year, absorbing the sun's invisible fire and softening it into warmth. It was not absolute, it never was, but it was enough. Enough to let life breathe without constant fear. Enough to let evolution explore longer paths. Enough to create a stage worthy of what was to come. Imagine the Earth at the close of the Proterozoic. Its skis were deep blue, its oceans shimmering with photosynthetic blooms. Multicellular organisms drifted in the shallows, fragile but persistent, their experiments in cooperation slowly becoming more intricate. Stromatolites still dotted the coasts, ancient witnesses to the planet's patience. The continents, though barren of forests or fields, stood ready, rocks weathered, soils forming, rivers cutting their paths. The world was quiet, but it was a quiet filled with anticipation. The ozone veil made this anticipation possible. Without it, the sun's ultraviolet blaze would have kept life bound in shadows and depths, fragile and fleeting, but with it, the stage expanded. The shallows became nurseries, the coasts became footholds, the skis became bearable. The quilted shield of ozone did not simply protect, it invited. It invited life to grow larger, to reach upward, to trust in the light. There is something profoundly cozy in imagining this pause before the storm of diversity. The Earth, clothed in safety, seemed to take a breath. It had endured bombardment, ice, upheaval, and silence. Now at last it was stable, steady, secure. Like a host who has set the table and waits for the guests, the planet rested in readiness. It had prepared its home, softened the skis, oxygenated the air, wrapped itself in protection, and now it only needed time. That time was not long in coming, not by the measure of deep history. In the blink of a few tens of millions of years, the Cambrian dawn would arrive. Life would surge into diversity, filling the oceans with forms never before seen, creatures with eyes and limbs, shells and spines, colors and movements. The great explosion of complexity was not born from chaos alone. It was born because the world had finally given it the conditions to thrive. The ozone veil was the curtain drawn back before the grand performance. From the perspective of the cosmos, the Earth at this moment shone like a promise. Blue skies wrapped its surface, white clouds drifted in patterns across its face, and beneath the waves, life prepared its next act. The veil above marked the line between two ages, the long patience of the Proterozoic and the vibrant flowering of the Cambrian. One was a story of endurance, the other a story of expression. And between them lay the ozone, the silent guardian, the quiet weaver of safety, the prelude to the symphony. The cozy truth is that all of life's brilliance rests upon such quiet preludes. Before the forests, there were microbes. Before the songs of birds, there was only breath in water. Before the explosion of diversity, there was the patient stitching of ozone across the sky. The Proterozoic gave us this prelude, long, quiet, steadfast, so that when the curtain lifted, life could step into the light unafraid. And so the eon ended, not with a crash or a roar, but with a veil complete. The earth was wrapped, the skies were softened, the seas were alive with promise. The quilt of ozone lay secure above, and beneath it, the stage was set for tomorrow. The Cambrian was coming. The story of the ozone veil is not one of sudden miracles or grand gestures. It is the story of patience, of molecules drifting upward, of sunlight breaking bonds and remaking them again. It is the story of microbes breathing in silence, unknowing yet indispensable. It is the story of a planet that clothed itself, stitch by stitch, until the harsh glare of its star was softened into a glow of safety. By the close of the Proterozoic, Earth had become something new. It was no longer a fragile world hiding from the sky, but a quilted planet, wrapped in a garment of protection. Its oceans no longer lived only in shadows, but bloomed with life under gentle light. Its shores no longer stood empty, but bore the first hesitant traces of mats stretching onto land. Its skies, once merciless, had deepened into a steady blue, serene and enduring. The ozone shield was not only a scientific boundary, it was a gift, a guardian, a veil that made all futures possible. Without it, the Cambrian dawn would have been silent. With it, the Cambrian became inevitable. Forests, rivers, creatures, wings, songs, civilizations, all of them were written in the threads of ozone long before they appeared. The sky waited for them, patiently, quietly, until the time was right. There is something profoundly cozy in knowing that we live still beneath that same quilt. When we walk under the blue dome, when we breathe deeply of the air, when we bask in sunlight without fear, we are experiencing the care written into the sky billions of years ago. We are sheltered still by the breath of the ancients, by the persistence of molecules, by the patience of Earth itself. The ozone shield is invisible to our eyes, but it is everywhere around us. It is the boundary between danger and safety, between silence and song, between barrenness and bloom. It is the gift of the smallest of lives to the greatest. It is the quiet promise that life belongs here. And so the story of ozone stabilization is not just a chapter in Earth's history. It is the foundation of our existence, the prelude to every moment of wonder that follows. It is the sky that waited, patiently, endlessly, so that one day, under its shelter, life could stand tall, breathe deeply, and dream of the stars.